Good afternoon. You can all take your seats. My name is Elizabeth Cousins. I'm the Deputy CEO of the UN Foundation, and I am absolutely delighted to be here with you all, and honored, as everybody else has been, to have this opportunity to reflect on Kofi Annan, who was such an inspiration and a guiding light to us all. You know, we have spoken in almost every session about Kofi's unwavering commitment to human dignity and to the ordinary people in every corner of the world whom it is the UN's highest and most ultimate responsibility to serve. And in this session, we want to talk more about that vision of a more inclusive United Nations for the peoples, about the many steps that Kofi Annan took in his time to open up the UN on so many dimensions, to reach out to publics, to engage new constituencies, to bring in NGOs, business, philanthropy, the research community, as well as about the unfinished business of that agenda today. Someone said at a dinner some of us were at last night that Kofi was an innovator before his time. And in his desire to open the doors of the UN and to be such an accessible Secretary General, he achieved a great deal in his time, but he also laid crucial groundwork for the kinds of challenges and demands and turbulence that we're facing today. So we want both to reflect on the past and the legacy, but especially to think about the future and the sort of steps that we all in our various ways need still to take. It's been striking throughout all the sessions also how much of a theme that has been from the morning yesterday straight through the sessions we've had today, and how much all of them have touched on these really incredible current tensions that are roiling our world, whether it's government-citizen relationships, whether it's this tension between top-down and bottom-up, whether it's about control versus emancipation, about different ways that accountability has to weave through. And it just reinforces to me how much, even 20 years ago, Kofi Annan, in all of the kinds of pioneering work that he did as Secretary General, was so prescient about some of those themes that are now at such a fever pitch today. And I'm just absolutely thrilled to be moderating this conversation today with two remarkable individuals who are very well known to you all. Edward Mortimer, who was Kofi Annan's communications director for 8 years and one of his most trusted advisors and confidants, both then and throughout the rest of Kofi's life. And now you're a distinguished fellow at All Souls College at the University of Oxford. And Kumi Naidoo, a lifelong social justice campaigner from South Africa, whose first taste of activism got you kicked out of school, and you have many other credits for breaking all of the right kinds of rules throughout your career. Kumi has held numerous leadership positions, including Civicus, Greenpeace, and you are now the 9th Secretary General of Amnesty International. You are both agitators for good, and it has been a real personal privilege to know both of you for a very long time. So, Edward, I'd love to start this conversation with you, and I do want to start first by stepping back. In his autobiography, Kofi wrote that one of the things that drove him to try to reach out beyond the UN was his absolute passion about poverty and the degree to which he saw the international community not taking poverty and the reality of the lives of so many people around the world seriously, and that he thought those added voices, those added agitators and actors could really add heft to that calling. Can you reflect a little bit on that time and kind of his determination to open up the UN, where that came from in him and how you and he saw it at the time?
It's funny because I was trying to remember whether I ever actually heard him say it in so many words, but I think it was very clear to me. I was sort of late comer in a way because I arrived in the middle of 1998. The Kofi Annan administration was up and running. He'd been to Baghdad, and I think had really caught the imagination of the world by appearing on television. And maybe that's one of the things it takes that we haven't talked about, a major international crisis in which suddenly everybody sees the Secretary General and a Secretary General who can speak in a quiet and sensible and reassuring way. And people think, gosh, thank God there's somebody like that there. And maybe we're still waiting for the current Secretary General to have that moment. So, people have said, one or two people have said very nice things about me in the course of these 2 days. I sort of felt that I was very lucky. I arrived in the middle of a process that was already well underway. I think the person who hasn't been mentioned enough is John Ruggie, who he brought in right at the beginning and who had this great idea of a Millennium Summit and a Millennium Report and eventually a Millennium Declaration. I arrived in time to help work on those, and that was a tremendously exciting thing. But what I sort of understood, I think, as the kind of guiding insight of all this was, we live now in an age where sort of everybody can see everybody else. The UN was created in 1945, probably the apogee of state power, when international relations really meant relations between states, and there wasn't all that much else. By 1997, 98, there were so many ways in which people in different countries could interact with each other, and of course, often instantaneously. Nobody was sort of waiting for the government to tell them what was happening in the rest of the world. People knew directly. And I think Kofi realized that that actually put the UN in a completely different context. And I mean, I can't exactly remember when or where he said it, but I sort of feel that what I imbibed and felt as being his sort of central insight was, we're an organization of member states, but if we don't reach out beyond governments, and if ordinary people around the world don't believe that we're doing something useful to them, we will be irrelevant in the 21st century. And that was the sort of guiding thing, so that, of course, the private diplomacy went on, and he was brilliant at that, and we've heard a certain amount about that. But what I felt I was there to help with was that there should be a message that people would hear and would come from the United Nations, and this man might be by the luck of the draw. I mean, I think probably not many people really had any idea that this was the kind of Secretary General he was going to be at the moment of his appointment. But there he was, and it was just an amazing opportunity. He could speak to the world and for the world. And of course, I think plenty of people have said, you actually can only do that if you're listening to the world and have some idea of what it is people care about and what they would like the United Nations to do for them.
Just being a remarkable messenger, but especially being such a remarkable listener and channeler of all that. But I think you're saying that he saw that already back then was extremely prescient, because I don't think many leaders would have quite seen that risk to the UN system even back then, as well as that urgent need to begin to build up that kind of base and that kind of engagement with the wider world. Kumi, can I turn to you and say you were this was at the beginning of your career. Well, actually your career started even before that, since you started at a very young age. But if you were very active in civil society circles and activism at the time. You actually served on the Secretary General's Commission on UN Civil Society Relations. How did you understand that ambition of Kofi Annan at the time, what the opportunities were, what you were trying to achieve, and just say a little bit about that time for you.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, and greetings, everybody. The one thing that I hope the current Secretary General will emulate was the frequency with which Kofi Annan reminded us of the words in the founding preamble of the Charter. He often would say, remember that the Charter starts with we the peoples of the United Nations, not we the nation states of the United Nations. And I think that he took that preamble very seriously and tried to give it a different, more holistic meaning than peoples equals nation states. When he launched the panel on UN civil society relations, he had already by then had made various efforts to open up lots of space for civil society. And I just want to share one small experience, because, you know, for me as then a young African civil society activist, like other African civil society activists, I just want to say, we should often say amongst ourselves, the UN might be completely screwed, but actually Kofi Annan makes us feel proud as Africans, right? I just want to say that. And so anyway, my first real substantive engagement with him in a public forum, I had the opportunity to have more smaller, was at the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg. And he came, as he did often, you know, he always made time to come to the civil society gathering. And I'll tell you, that summit, the heads of state were meeting in Sandton, the most richest part of Joburg, and the civil society were in Soweto, like 45 minutes away in the most poorest part of Soweto. And he was able to move between those two worlds. But it's more than just the physical thing, the symbolic capability that he had, the ability to talk to a Kumi Naidu, who was a nobody, and to speak to princes, heads of state, and so on. And I think that that's one of the missing element of leadership we have today. There are very few people that can genuinely engage with the poor and marginalized on the one hand and engage with people of power on the other. So in any case, I'm there, I'm like nervous, in awe. I'm in my 30s, I'm like, I get a chance to, a few of us were picked to ask questions from the floor. So when my turn came, I said, Secretary General, I put it to you that the UN suffers from a democratic deficit, a coherence deficit, a compliance deficit, and a legitimacy deficit. What is your response? And especially, can you speak to the question of the UN suffering from a democratic deficit? So most people got shocked that I asked the question. And even there was this more senior African civil society leader, and said, how could you ask such a stupid question? Right? So I'm like panicking, what is he going to say? And he said, you're absolutely right. He said the UN is stuck in the geopolitics of 1945, and unless it can break out of the geopolitics of 1945, it's not going to be able to fulfill its full purpose. And we do have a challenge of having to reform it. And Rome was not built on one day. We're doing one piece at a time. And so then after that, he invited me to be on the UN Civil Society panel. The vision behind that was quite ambitious. It was really about going beyond the rhetoric of saying the UN appreciates civil society to really be putting in place mechanisms that will really strengthen the capability of UN civil society to participate. Sadly, the recommendations of that panel came out 1 month before the Iraq war started, and that recommendations died with several 100,000 Iraqi citizens, right? It sits on a shelf. But for example, I'll just give you a few bullet points. There was a proposal for the Assistant Secretary General for Civil Society to bring civil society right at the center of the governance of the UN. We have problems with civil society accreditation. Certain member states about how they accredit, like say China was mentioned. If you're a Chinese NGO and you try to apply, the way the process is, not, by the way, several countries, even countries that claim to be democracies, block the accreditation of NGOs, troublesome NGOs from their countries. So we came up with a proposal of how we're going to fix that, take the politics out of accreditation and so on. I would conclude by saying that one of, I think, his unique things was he did genuinely make time to be at civil society events. Things where, okay, he would come to a civil society event and maybe then meet the head of state wherever that event was happening. But I know for sure that in the time I knew him that there were at least 10 events that I was involved in organizing where he said, I will come to it. And I would conclude by saying that his understanding of civil society was not always exactly the same as some of the folks in civil society, because a lot of people in civil society wrongly use NGOs and civil society interchangeably. And he had the correct understanding, which is that it was much broader. It includes faith organizations, trade unions, and so on. And I think where we had a little bit of a tension with him was around business, right? So I, for one, and many others recognized that the UN needed to engage with business, and we supported the Global Compact's work and so on. But we then had a worry, and we have the worry more so today, about whether, in fact, certain big businesses have got too much of influence in the processes and so on of the UN. especially at a time when nation states cannot or do not want to meet their financial contributions and so on. We think it's probably something that needs to be watched, and it poses a potential danger.
Well, let me actually follow up on that one, because we want to talk about the unfinished business of his vision of a more inclusive United Nations with much greater and more meaningful engagement with many different sectors. And I wanted to ask you about business, so why don't we take advantage of where you left off to ask you that question. That was a controversial idea at the time. We obviously have the Global Compact now. We've had several generations of it. And we have, I think, now what is conventional wisdom that business is an absolutely indispensable part of meeting the SDGs, to growing economies, to all kinds of environmental goods in the world and other things. And yet, there are also still concerns, suspicion, skepticism about the right way to engage business, how serious different private sector actors really are, and how to think about that in this larger agenda of a more inclusive and engaged United Nations. So can I ask, maybe I'll turn first, Edward, to you to just say how you see that component of this agenda, both from what you tried to do during that time and kind of where you see the agenda now.
About the private sector?
About the private sector,
yes.
First.
I think it is very important, and I think Kumi is absolutely right that it was quite controversial at the time. Somebody coined the phrase rainbow washing. No, blue washing, sorry, that's blue washing, because there was already a notion of green washing, and we see a great deal of that now, major corporations that suddenly sort of signal all kinds of virtue in the way they deal with climate issues, when we know they're actually lobbying desperately to prevent effective legislation to force them to reduce carbon emissions or whatever it may be. So that worry was definitely around at the time. But I mean, I think that Kofi always wanted to do things through dialogue. And I mean, I remember if you put in a draft something very sharp about corporations, or indeed anybody or anything more or less, he would say, tone this down a bit. We want to co-opt these people, not hit them over the head. So I think his thought was, this is the real world. Corporations are very powerful. It's the height of globalization. It's a fantastic picnic, which they're really enjoying. And I think Annika alluded to this yesterday. He went to Davos in January 1999, and there was the sort of global business elite. I think actually not enough of the American business elite, but certainly the European and a lot of multinationals. And I remember John Ruggie and I did a lot of work on this speech, but it was basically John's idea that in the nation state in the 20th century, business bought into the idea there had to be something in it for everybody. But if it was only a picnic for some, sooner or later there would be revolution. And that was really how welfare states of the 20th century came about. And it's been pretty successful by and large. And we had to do something like that on the global scale. And so you had to try and address directly the people who are at the heads of these corporations and say, if you want this picnic to continue, you've got to invite the rest of the world. There's got to be, and I mean, it became a sort of cliche more, as I think Claire Shaw talks about them making globalization work for the poor and so on. Unfortunately, most of these things remained empty slogans, and the result, that's why we are where we are now. If people had actually read and listened to that speech in 1999, it did lead to setting up the Global Compact. I think Global Compact has done a lot of good work. It's the biggest global corporate social responsibility initiative in the world today. But I don't think at a deeper level the message was really absorbed and accepted. It was something that people have paid lip service to. And I think that's why the world is in the really rather dire state that it is now.
Well, and the SDGs do give another opportunity for a kind of new way of thinking about private sector engagement. I think of something like the Business and Sustainable Development Commission and any number of other exercises, though still sometimes triggering this question about how internalized really are the commitments and how to be serious about that type of relationship in a new era of partnership. So, Kumi, you've worked, a lot on these issues and thought a lot about issues of accountability, transparency, and how to tighten up some of those kinds of relationships. How do you think about the private sector question?
Well, I agree with Ed and with the broad thrust of what Kofi Annan was trying to do, which was to say you can't ignore the business community. They're far too powerful, they're far too pervasive, and we need to try to get them within our sphere of influence and try to bring some moderation to the excessive behavior and try to move them to do some good things. And to be honest, Kofi Annan, in his time of leadership, set the basis of a range of corporations who delivered things that they would never have otherwise done. You know, the Dutch Transportation Committee, I think TNT it's called, out to the world full program with tens of millions of free transportation of, the list is quite long, right? So all of those things in terms of enhancing the service delivery capability of the UN, like with UNDP or UNICEF and so on, WFP was good. But here's the problem. We have to ask ourselves, how does change happen, right? And change happened at a macro, meso, micro level, by which I mean micro, the delivery of projects, programs, and so on. And there, at both at the national level and at the global level, governments are very happy to embrace the energy of civil society because we are complementing their delivery capability. And quite often, let's be blunt about it, many governments at the national level see civil society as a cheap labor because we're delivering things at a much cheaper level, whether the government is paying for it or not paying for it, but it actually is ensuring that the anger of people is less because the pain that they're living in terms of exclusion is made less by some support, right? Then at a meso level, policy change, right? So you can get businesses to, offer you some services, some money, some infrastructure. But when we look at what are the policies businesses are pursuing in the way that they operate on a daily basis, to a large extent, the global business community on climate, we're part of denying to a large extent. On many of the economic justice questions, like for us in Africa, a big issue for us is the bleeding of the wealth of the African continent, where $1 flows in aid and $8 is flowing in terms of capital flight, repatriation of profits, and so on. And when we are, for example, raising policy questions about taxation and ensuring that the most wealthiest and certainly the big companies should be taxed at a much higher level, right? And that is what's going to give you change, substantive change, not a couple of crumbs that you throw from your corporate social responsibility budget, right? That's where we're not getting traction with the business community. And then anything that's about changing fundamental governance under which, at a macro level. So I think with the business community, we need to learn something that history teaches us about how governments and big businesses have operated. One of the things they're very good at is divide and rule. And on our side in civil society, we have made a mistake where we homogenize business. We need to do what we are now doing much better, which is divide and rule the business community. You actually have to say, well, this 10% have the potential for serious transformative change, and this 10%, you can do whatever you want, they're going to defend. These are the fossil fuel companies and so on that are still denying the science. And in the middle, you got the bulk who are greenwashing, bluewashing, trying to do the minimum. So you want to shift people in that direction, and I think it's doable. I'll just tell you on a lighter note, when I was at Greenpeace, I went in with two, what people saw as contradictory messages. One is we need to intensify our resistance to environmental destruction and intensify civil disobedience, and we need to intensify our dialogue with the business community, right? And people saw that as a contradiction. I don't. We have to be able to do both at this moment in history, and I can tell you that what I found with the engagements with CEOs of big companies, one success rate with CEOs who are in the second and third marriages with young kids, especially on climate change, your success rate is much higher, right? So you have to figure out which CEOs are in that situation, not using any invasive privacy things. You just what's on the internet, and
Social pages.
yeah. And I can tell you that when in a discussion you can say, but your daughter man told you. What are you going to say to your daughter when 5 years from now she says, why did you not act when the science was clear and so on? And and if you know this daughter's name because it was in the internet, it actually sounds more powerful. But so what I'm saying is civil society also cannot take an ideological position with business. We have to recognize that they are diverse, complex, changing. And contrary to a perspective that I heard earlier today, that we cannot rely on appealing to, say, older people that you need to act for your grandchildren or your children, I do think you can't rely on that on your own. But one of the things about moving people is not, when you see a CEO of a company, you have to first see the person as a human being and understand that his CEO role is one role. But if you understand the person in its entirety, and that's what Kofi Annan, I think, mastered. You know, he knew how to read people, he knew how to move the dial, he knew that you wouldn't be able to move it like that, but provided you were moving it substantively in the direction of progress, he was willing to take that risk on business, and I don't think it was a wrong call for him to have made.
And he operated on both levels. I mean, that there was a sort of slightly folksy sort of general approach. He was loved to produce African proverbs, and one of them was, the earth is not ours. We have it, we hold it in trust for our children, which is very good, all-purpose message. It's hard for anybody to resist. But then there was a very practical problem, which, and Mark Sisman mentioned this morning, the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. There was a very specific problem at that time, which was that AIDS was treatable, and it was no longer a major problem in rich countries because people were being treated with antiretroviral drugs. But there were millions of people in poor countries who couldn't afford these. And the pharmaceutical companies didn't really want to do anything about this because not because they were making a lot of money in poor countries, but because they were afraid that if one of them lowered prices there, then others would take advantage of it. Now, nothing, as far as I can recall, in the Charter of the United Nations says that this sort of problem has anything to do with the Secretary General. But actually, he was probably the only person who could bring together, and he did this, the heads of all the major pharmaceutical companies, and started talking to them about this problem. One of them very nearly left the room because he thought he was being asked to participate in a price ring, but Kofi persuaded him to stay. And the result is that they did agree collectively to lower the price of ARV drugs in poor countries. And I would think that one decision by itself has the result that there must be many thousands of people, particularly in Africa today, many more, who are alive who would not be. So that shows, on the one level it can all sound sort of very folksy and highfalutin, but actually it can make an extraordinary difference engaging with people about a practical problem and getting them to talk to each other in a reasonable way. I don't know that anybody except the Secretary General of the United Nations could actually have got those people together to have that conversation.
He wedded empathy with strategy in a really, really profound way.
I just want to fully support what Ed says and say that, we must not forget that Kofi Annan probably also was one of the many Secretary Generals spoke about gender equality over time, but I think Kofi Annan took it to a different level and certainly opened up much more space for the women's movement. I'm not saying that he was perfect on gender equity or on climate, but he did do much better, I think, and I hope that that continues. But there was a point made earlier, in the earlier panel, about the core purpose of the UN was peace. And so, Ed, you said HIV/AIDS, that, for example, was not in his formal mandate to take up.
HIV/AIDS wasn't, but any idea.
Any idea,
it would sort of convene people, non-governmental people. I mean, for a meeting on a sort of major public health issue. I mean, that just was not part of the original blueprint for the UN.
But that's exactly the point I'm trying to make, because I think Kofi Annan had the right reading of what it takes to build peace in the world, right? Because one of the things that he also did, and we must not forget this piece of work, he supported this Commission on Human Security, which was led by the Japanese
Sadako
Sadako Ogata, and so on. And Amartya Sen.
Yes.
And that piece of work was, if you go look at that work, that's probably one of the important pieces of work the UN did, where he showed the intersectionality. I referred to the question of his contribution to women to make the point that he took something from the feminist movement, which was the power of intersectionality, and he understood the link between peace and the economy, peace and health, peace and climate, and so on. And yeah, you know, it's not a source that I commonly quote, but and I think Kofi Annan would agree with what I'm about to say, I strongly support the CIA and the Pentagon when in 2002, in a report submitted to President Bush on the key threats in the coming decades to peace and stability, the CIA and Pentagon report said the biggest threat is not conventional threats, not terrorism, but will come from the threats of climate change. 2002. Didn't suit George Bush, he buried that report, right? And so if you think today about what constitutes the peace agenda, we have to, I would argue, include in it massive public health crises like...
Actually, I think this idea, it's not in any of the articles of the Charter, but it's in the preamble, because the notion, a condition, I used to carry it in my pocket, but there's that phrase about better standards of life in larger freedom, and then there's something about conditions which enable international agreements to be observed. In other words, if people are suffering, and something is going very, very badly wrong, doesn't matter how nice treaties you have or sort of institutional arrangements. And I think we heard a very good example this morning about the trip to Mali, and he looks at the conditions and says, if this goes on, there'll be war. So it is about peace, and I think it's absolutely right that and of course, this was a central idea for Kofi, that there were these three mutually reinforcing pillars on which the UN was built: peace and security, development, human rights. And that was the whole theme of the Larger Freedom report.
And what you're also saying is that he took the charter, the core purpose of the UN, and probably every mandate he came in touch with as a floor, not a ceiling, and as an invitation to think about what it really required, not as a kind of straitjacket of what you need to do. And I think that is something that over the years, since that period in the 90s that people have talked about as a golden era, I think perhaps a little nostalgically, I don't think it felt so golden at the time, but that is something that
was the age
over
of
many
Rwanda and
years has been
Srebrenica.
lost.
You know, we didn't think of it as a golden era. A lot of people use the phrase "the New World Disorder" already
That's
then.
right.
Yeah.
There's so many questions I want to ask these two gentlemen, but I know I want to open it to the floor because I know all of you will have many thoughts. And I think we have a little bit of license to go over our time because we started late. I'm just going to assume we have it. I will do my best to see. There's a lot of light in my face. I will do like everybody else and try to look for a diverse set of interlocutors. But I'm going to go to this gentleman on the right first in the back.
Thank you very much. My name's Jamie Pladel-Bouvier. I'm with Crisis Action. If we the peoples is to mean anything, then probably millions, if not billions, more people around the world need to have at least a very basic understanding about what the United Nations is and what it stands for. With Kofi, there was that real sense that he built a global public profile and was able to forge a connection with global citizens. It doesn't really feel like we have that at the moment. And with nationalism on the rise across the world, and one of the hallmarks of nationalism being the rise of charismatic populist leaders, are we not in quite desperate need of a leader of the UN, a Secretary General, who is able to publicly and much more aggressively be a champion and a leader, a defender of multilateralism? Thank you.
Great. I'm going to take a few questions at once. I have a woman in the back of the room, blonde hair. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Anna Mikus. I'm the Program Director of the Bonavera Institute of Human Rights at the University of Oxford, which was actually inaugurated by Kofi Annan a year ago. And I wanted to come back to the issue of human rights, which many mentioned is really an important moment as well to speak up for. And I'm wondering what more can we do, especially as civil society, but maybe also academia, to support that and also look at the reform processes currently at the United Nations.
Terrific. I have Mr. Brahimi. I'm doing my best to find you in order, so bear with me. Yes.
Thank you very much.
And with the exception of Mr. Brahimi, you can all introduce yourself. I appreciate it as you go.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm so very glad that Edward has spoken about that visit to Baghdad. First of all, you know, I don't think many people know how he went to Baghdad. You know, he didn't write a letter to the President of the Security Council informing him that he wanted to go to Baghdad. He invited the members of the Security Council for a chat in his office. And he told them, I'm going to Baghdad. You know, I know at least one member who was extremely agitated to hear this news. And then, you know, two important moments. One was mentioned by Edward, and that is when we returned from Baghdad. Every single member of the staff was downstairs waiting for coffee. You see, that means that everybody who worked in the United Nations realized how serious the problem was and where that would have taken us. Another moment also as important is when, in spite of that huge achievements, a few months later, the British and the Americans started bombing Baghdad again, Iraq again. And that, then Kofi said one word. This is a bad day for the United Nations and a bad day for the world. You know, in hindsight, I would have liked to see the world, you know, stand up and shout. You know, there is a danger. There is a danger that was averted a few months ago, I think it was in February, and that danger is back again. That did not happen, unfortunately, and this is one of the great things that Kofi did and hasn't been talked about enough.
Thank you. I have Ian Martin in the back. Sorry. And then the gentleman in the far back from this morning. So first, Ian.
Thanks. I want to ask Kumi a question that I don't think I would know the answer to if I were Secretary General of Amnesty International. There have been sort of two recurrent themes through these 2 whole days. One is how important was the way in which Kofi communicated the core values of the Charter on human rights, the way that he opened the door across the UN system to the High Commissioner of Human Rights to be more effective in influencing the system as a whole. That theme has been very strong. And sometimes the criticism of Antonio Guterres, in contrast, has almost been explicit. Sometimes it has been explicit. So I'm adding a rider to the first 2 questions here. But the other recurrent theme has been a very strong recognition of the geopolitical moment and how unfavorable is the member state context, and how a Secretary General is liable to be cut off his knees by China in particular, but by other member states, and a context exists in which it's extremely difficult for that voice to be effective. So I guess my question to you, Kumi, is how does civil society enlarge the space for the Secretary General to be the voice that people here want the Secretary General to be, either directly or through recreating a constituency among member states, which frankly doesn't seem to exist today?
One more from the very back, the gentleman from this morning's panel, and then we'll come back to our...
Thank you. My name is Alvin Carpio. I run an organization called the Fourth Group. Last month, it was the first time I actually went to the United Nations in Geneva as a tourist, doing a tour, and then in the bookshop, they've got copies of the Charter. And what's really interesting in this debate around democracy and participation was particularly Articles 8 and 22, which stated that people are eligible for participation no matter where they're from, and also in 22 that the UN can create new subsidiary organs depending on its needs. Now, we're talking about we the peoples, and democracy is the rule of the people. Do you ever think that there will be a global vote for a representative? And Kumi, I really like the suggestion of an Assistant Secretary General who would represent civil society. Is that a potential route to kind of be bold and do something quite drastic to fight against the nationalism that the fellow questioner asked about?
So we have a series of interlinked questions. I'm going to come back to both of you, and then we'll do one more round from the floor. So we hope to be able to get all of you before we're done. Pick and choose.
I mean, to a considerable extent, I think they're all the same question, really, which is how much was it just a golden window? As I say, it didn't feel like that at the time, but in hindsight, and compared to what we're living in now, and of course compared to the Cold War, which came before it, it was a golden window. And so how far is it possible for anybody to be the kind of Secretary General that Kofi was now? And I mean, I'd be interested to hear Kumi's answer to the question from Ian, but I don't think one can honestly say with confidence that, of course, you know, all you need is to be really brave and you can do it. I think it's much more complicated than that. And I think it was, Ian, I think it was said yesterday that the price of courage has got very high. Member states, or some of them, are prepared to be extremely vicious in retaliating against UN officials, including the Secretary General, if they think that they've overstepped the mark. And so I think that the most important thing, you know, in all of this is for us not to make it sound easy, or, you know, that we're scoring points off the people who have to try and do this job now. I'm sure that we all wish them well. There was a reference to the 1 for 7 billion effort a couple of years ago, which I played some part in on behalf of the elders. And, you know, it was very encouraging at the time. And I think we did open up the process for choosing the Secretary General. And I think many of us felt it would have been even better if he was a woman. But actually, we got a very good Secretary General as a result of that process. And of course, now we feel, well, why in that case aren't we hearing him more? And is it because they're not reporting his speeches? Is it because he hasn't got the right communications officials to draft those speeches and make them heard? You know, is it because he's keeping his head down? I mean, I think it's a bit of all of those things. I hope that, you know, they can be cured. I mean, well, not cured, but palliated at least. But what seems to me a key lesson that we should have learnt from these 2 days is the bit about the stubborn optimism. The way I remember Kofi saying it was, well, if you work for the United Nations, you have to be optimistic. But I think the exact way that you express that optimism and how far you push it, how far you challenge or needle people, particularly powerful member states, at any given moment, is a matter of very, very fine judgment. And don't imagine that everybody was always praising Kofi all the time. Sometimes people thought that he'd gone too far, or some people did. Other times, people thought that he should go further. And I think that does, to a considerable extent, come with the job. But I do also agree that it's up to us, civil society, to do what we can to strengthen the international institutions, support them, and create the space in which they can work. So over to you, Kumi.
Thanks,
job,
Ed.
Kumi.
Yeah. And by the way, Ed, it's never too late for you to make a comeback. So, to Jamie's question from Crisis Action on the rise of populism and demonization and so on that we see, and the undermining of multilateralism, I mean, I would just say that I think, please, I'm saying it as a self-critical thing as well, right? So I think most of us are suffering from a bad case of cognitive dissonance. I think we are in denial about how close to the cliff we are. We are not talking sufficiently to people who are living on the front lines of misery, right? and where things are getting substantially worse. And I think that what is needed right now is for voices within the UN system to be speaking out. I think it's difficult given the governance of the UN, for example, for the Secretary General to call out fascist behavior on the part of the United States administration. I said that, fascist behavior on behalf of the United States administration. If you look at the classical definition of fascism, right, undermine the media, undermine political institutions, divide people on the basis of identity, use misinformation and so on. And I have to say, I find it pretty horrific that there's a state visit going on right now and that it's seen largely as normal. And we need to recognize that this moment of where a lot of things are seen as normal is a moment where we should remind ourselves what Martin Luther King once said when he said, I note that in the field of modern child psychology, there's a very dominant term called maladjusted. Now, all of us want to be well-adjusted and not suffer from schizophrenia or other mental illnesses. But my friends, I say to you, there are certain things in the world that are so immoral and unjust that good, decent people should refuse to be well-adjusted to. He goes on to say, I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry, racial discrimination, the mindless expenditure of military money, huge amounts on military expenditure when people don't have food to eat. And importantly, he said, I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few, when millions of God's children are smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society. He was talking about the US in the mid-60s, right? That is more relevant to the US today. And bottom line, let me just say, I say this with humility, and I say this as somebody who attends a lot of conferences like this one. I think that our conversations are stuck. I think we are not willing to actually concede that, in fact, we are engaged in rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic type conversations, when what we need to be looking at is much more substantive change. If you look at our response to the 2008 financial crisis, those with power, it was all about system recovery, system protection, system maintenance. But what we should have learned from that moment and previous moments is that what humanity needs is system innovation, system redesign, and system transformation. Anemic, on human rights content, let me just say that Michelle Bachelet, the relatively new High Commissioner for Human Rights, and myself were speaking at the 20th anniversary of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights Defenders. And she spoke before me and said, you know, I really wonder whether today, even if we tried to pass the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whether we'd succeed. And I said, Michelle, I can put you out of your misery. If we tried to pass it today, not only would we never get it passed in the UN system, we would not get off the starting blocks because, you know, remember Eleanor Roosevelt's role in that? Today, the US would be the country that would block it as much as China would block it, given the politics of power and how it... So I think we have to recognize that human rights is in a dire, dire strait right now, that we have to fight back really hard, and we have to also be willing, I believe, to engage in much more strident civil disobedience, because all of our political leaders seem to be suffering from the same medical condition, which is they have a problem hearing. And the only way we can get through when they have this medical problem is to make sure that we are creative, we are innovative, we are loud, we are vociferous in terms of how we get the message across. To Lakhdar Brahimi, who's left the room, I think that moment that he talks about, people didn't shout out when Kofi Annan was standing up against the US and Britain in terms of Iraq. I think just to note that I remember I was there. It was a very cold February day when close to, it felt like 5 million people, but it was less than that. It was more like 1 million people almost that marched in New York, in Barcelona, in London, which led the New York Times to actually say that there's no more a unipolar world, right? Anybody remembers what the New York Times said? We now have the second superpower, and the second superpower was the civil society mobilization, which was to support the UN and support Kofi Annan. And I remember Nelson Mandela, and I don't know whether you remember this, Nelson Mandela was, pardon my English, but he was seriously pissed off with Britain and the US and so on. And he went so far as saying, there are many people around me who say that if the Secretary General of the UN was a white man, the UK and the US would not be behaving as they do. Okay? You remember that? Yeah. So what I'm saying is that notwithstanding the fact that there was quite a lot of mobilization to support Kofi Annan, and I was directly involved in that from the outside, we failed, right? And that tells us that the level of popular mobilization that we need to be able to muster in the current moment when the climate science says we've got 11 years now to get emissions to peak and start coming down, we in civil society have to recognize that we have to up our game. We are not good enough right now. We are still speaking in language that's elitist, that does not resonate with the very people that vote for Brexit and that vote for Donald Trump. And we must say to ourselves on the progressive side of history that it's not that Steve Bannon and all the right-wing crazies are that talented, right? And it's our failure to read the moment and to mobilize in the ways that will have impact. Ian, sorry, I'm getting the look that I'm taking too long. So Ian, on the question of how do we engage the voice of civil society, I think we have to be, okay, one is there's behind the scenes channels which are in place. They need to be refreshed under the new administration where, for example, when civil society people end up in prison, we need to be able to get parts of the UN system behind the scene to kick into action to support us, for example, right? Similarly, of course, we want to support the different demands that the issues that the UN is pushing. And I think you'll see that with the climate summit. The moment the current Secretary General called the climate summit, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Amnesty, and a few other organizations came together to do a pre-summit in New York, which is going to be called the Summit on Human Survival. It's bringing non-environmental actors to the table to say climate change is not simply an environmental issue, and we have to support those that have been fighting for so long.
So I've committed cardinal sin as a moderator because I'm going to have to renege on my commitment to go back to the room. That's quite all right. I'm getting no. It's and but I think I hope you will agree with why I wanted to allow Edward and Kumi to take time to really give a full expression to responding to the questions they have had. I do want to give you one round to have any final thoughts, which may anticipate questions you might have been asked from the many people in the room who still want to ask you questions, who can also find you at the reception. And I just want to remind, if this is a useful focal point or not, Amina Mohammed last night sort of touched on a lot of these themes when she asked about how we trigger a real popular mobilization around these issues, around the fact that our world is in a much worse shape than we thought, that part of the hope, and not just the hope, but the strategy in a way, is to find ways to come together around common purpose and collective action. But how do you stimulate in a real way that kind of popular base of support for the kinds of things we're talking about? So if that is in any way a hook for your final comments, and if not, you can say anything you wish. So Edward, let me go to you first, and then we'll conclude with Kumi.
Well, I'm just delighted to hear about this pre-summit, because I think we really got beyond the point where we can treat climate change as being in any sense a specialist subject, which is the concern of experts. We obviously have not paid enough attention to the experts. The experts have been telling us what to think about it pretty consistently for at least 30 years, if not 50. It is really an issue for society as a whole, and if we don't deal with it, there won't be any human rights. There will be conflict. There will be all these things wrong with the world. So good on you that you're getting the other parts of civil society to accept that this is the #1 priority, and that message must definitely reach the UN, and it should be going out from the UN. If we want to mobilize civil society, we have to listen to civil society. It's very clear, and it's been said today and yesterday, the movements that actually got people in the streets, they've got my granddaughter has been on the BBC World Service and has got a standing ovation in Oxford Town Hall from the City Council because she's started a movement to say we must have climate change as a core subject in our school curriculum. We're the ones who are going to have to cope with it. So this is the civil society that the UN has to listen to, and this is the civil society that the UN has to do something for.
And that Kofi started us listening 2 years ago.
Ed, let me just tell you, please say a big thank you to your granddaughter, because these children are behaving like the adults, and the adults are behaving like kids. Right. So let me tell you what Peter Thunberg says. She says, you know, when we're growing up, right, our parents tell us don't play with fire, don't go into the hot stove and so on. And now our whole world is on fire, and our parents are taking a sleep and letting politicians and opportunistic business leaders get away with murder. And by the way, these kids, I marched with them here in London. They are so creative. Their slogans are much better than the very highly paid, you know, communication specialist, sorry, Ed. You know, like for example, just to give you two slogans, as we walked past, they said, Downing Street, you can get better cabinets at IKEA. and the second one, I'm going to conclude on a positive note. The second one also said, keep Earth clean. It's not Uranus. But I just want to conclude on a positive point on your call. Let's understand very clearly that people like myself have probably said it many times, save the planet, save the environment, save the climate. Let's end with some good news. The planet is fine. The planet actually does not need saving. Because if we continue on the suicidal trajectory that we're on, do not make the changes to get off our addiction of fossil fuels, do not protect indigenous peoples, do not ensure that we reduce consumption, right? And by the way, the problem of consumption, which is not talked about in climate change, and it's a big dodge of all of us, right? Because we're very good at saying, you know, we need to address poverty, but basically, if we have to give the same lifestyle that people in UK and US and so on have, as WWF says, we would need 5 to 8 planets. So the question of overconsumption in the north and underconsumption in the south has to be on the table if we're going to get serious. So if we continue on this path, the end result would be we warm up the planet, as we're seeing in parts of Africa. We lose our water, we lose our soil, we can't grow food. And the end result is we will be gone. Actually, the planet will still be here. And the good news is once we become extinct, the oceans will recover, the forests will grow back, and so on. So don't worry about the planet. We have to understand the struggle to avert catastrophic climate change is nothing more and nothing less than protecting the human rights of the next generation. We are seeing the biggest intergenerational violation of human rights by the current adult political and business leadership in the world. It's a crime. Our children are calling out, and let's hope that the UN system will do its part to ensure that we get much more accelerated progress on addressing climate change. Thank you.
I just want to close with one note, which was in the video we saw earlier of Kofi Annan. He talked about everybody doing their little bit. He obviously spent his life doing so much more than a little bit, and you both have done so much more than a little bit in your lives, and I just want to thank you for that, and thank everybody in this room for all of it.